The whole intent of it is to dilute the movement, to ensure that it doesn't, whatever we're asking for, we don't get. In the meantime, presenting themselves as wanting the same things as we want. But what we don't understand is, for white people to want the same things that black people want would mean that eventual end to their existence.
Right.
No human being, no living thing will consent to something that will further their demise. And we can't even claim that we're our ancestors' wildest dreams, and then not acknowledge that white people are also their ancestors' wildest dreams. You see what I'm saying? So if you're going to speak these things, you have to understand that there's an opposite to any and everything. And once you understand that, then you start to understand, okay, well, if I'm my ancestors and they're their ancestors, there's a conflict. Abibis Bahodie family, we are back today with another video. This one is going to be a very interesting topic, one that we talk about quite often. Today we want to touch on the importance of understanding how white allies are not beneficial to the black African community.
We just want to open this video with a quick disclaimer. When we're discussing these things, we're discussing it from a standpoint of heavy research and scientific data. So when you say that, and a spiritual connection, because when we say that, because a lot of times when you talk about topics of this nature, people get very emotional. So we're asking our audience to please, if you have any emotional attachments to your Rugu, put those emotional attachments to the side.
At least for this video.
At least for this video, because a lot of what we're saying may be deemed controversial in some circles.
Right.
But just because they are controversial conclusions doesn't in any way diminish their truthfulness.
Yeah.
So a lot of things we say may strike a chord, but we're saying these things because we believe that this is the truth that needs to be spoken.
Right.
If we are to grow and advance as a race.
Right. And a lot of people won't put themselves on the line to say these things. They have jobs, they have commitments to things that doesn't allow them to speak truth. So they may know these things, but they're in a position where they can't. And we are, unfortunately, we're in a position to be able to speak truth without any hesitance.
Right. So the title of this is Yoruba Allies, Our Ancestors' Worst Nightmare. So why are Yoruba allies our worst nightmare? Our ancestors' worst nightmare. And I think we can't begin to really understand that statement without first clarifying something called the Asili. And the Asili is something that's fundamental in understanding any group of people.
Right.
It's a term that was coined by the great master teacher Marimba Ani, and she describes the Asili as the cultural DNA of a people. So it's a mix of everything that defines a person and how they behave within a society, from their sexuality to their politics, to their economic principles, to their religion. Unless you understand the Asili of a people, you don't understand that people.
You'll be very...
And the Asili of the European, or the Eurasian, as they can be more properly called, can be traced back to the icy regions of the Caucasus Mountains. And when you look at what type of environment that they lived in the Caucasus Mountains, you get a better idea of why they behave in the way they have been behaving for the past, 5 centuries.
Yeah.
So we defer to a lot of our teachers and researchers to inform us, and one of the great teachers who had a lot to say on this was the great Sheikh Anta Diop. And Sheikh Anta Diop, he had this theory of the two cradles. And the two cradles was the northern cradle, which is the domain of Yoruba or the European, and the southern cradle, which is the domain of the African. And the northern cradle was distinct because this was an area that was very scarce in natural resources.
Yeah.
It was a glacial environment, and the soil was glacial, so the soil was depleted of any type of nutrients.
Right.
And they were also subjected to a very nomadic lifestyle, which was to be contrasted to the sedentary agricultural lifestyle that was common within the African environment.
Right.
So when you come out of a scarce environment where you're relying on hunting to feed yourself, that naturally breeds aggressive tendencies.
Yeah.
And those aggressive tendencies were regularly unleashed on each other within that environment. So white men would often cannibalize their children, they would cannibalize their wives, and these were ways that they had to act in order to survive. So you can't take somebody out of such a harsh environment like that and then expect them to develop the type of moral conscience that builds healthy, whole communities. And conversely, within the African environment, we lived in a place of abundance where fruits and vegetables were plentiful.
We had everything we needed.
We had everything we needed, so there was no need to kill our neighbor for resources, because the resources was the property of everybody. There was a communal understanding of relations between people,
right.
And that communalism is manifest in how we interact even to this day. African people, we're very hospitable people. We're
very
people
forgiving,
very forgiving,
very kind, very
we're
welcoming.
very loving towards the stranger, and that lovingness has been used against us historically in the plundering and pillaging of African lands.
Right.
Whether we're talking about the invasion of Kemet or we're talking about the invasion of the African continent as a whole by the European colonizers. So that's the basis of our critique of this phenomenon of white allyship is this can only happen when we have a misunderstanding about what are the principles and the origins of the white Asili.
Right.
And once we understand what lies behind the white Asili, we can then get at why this phenomenon of white allyship is counterproductive for black liberation.
Right, and because we're traveling right now, we don't have all of the books that we would like to display on each one of these topics, but we will list them, or we'll put the name of books for the topic that we're referencing for you to, research on your own.
And on another note of clarification, we have to also, in the same way we define what the Asili of the white person is, we also have to define what does it mean to be in an alliance. Okay,
yes.
and when we're looking at alliances, we want to raise our consciousness to see how alliances operate on the level of geopolitics. So historically, whenever you had alliances, they've been based off of mutual interest, meaning two powers see one common goal, and they are willing to cooperate with another power in order to achieve that common goal.
Right.
But common interests suggest a commonality of experience, a commonality of living conditions, and a commonality of material wealth.
Right.
And when you look at statistically, when you look at what's the gap is between wealth in America between black and white, it's so vast that there is no conceivable interest to be had. So every interest that we allege to be acted in, those interests aren't actual, but they're manufactured.
Yeah.
And you can't form a real sustained movement against white supremacy based off of manufactured interests.
Right.
Do you have anything specifically that you can point to as a manufactured interest, like an interest that black people have adopted as theirs, whereas really, if you dig deep enough, it can be traced back to European interests?
It's almost like children allying with adults.
Right.
Like, the titles are completely different, the roles are completely different, the responsibilities are completely different. So there would be really, children don't have a defense. Like they can't defend themselves against adults. So how is an adult going to ally with a child?
Right.
So it's very it's a conflict at every level. It's a conflict, and we can also see it the way America allies with smaller countries.
Right.
Like it's always to keep the population oppressed. It's never to liberate anybody.
Right. So, for example, and my wife, she points out how America allies with other countries to keep the population suppressed. Think about the history between the United States and Cuba, which, by the way, is an African country. 60% of the Cuban population is of African descent.
Right.
Whenever you have a nation that abandons its subservience to a superior power, that's when they become a threat.
Right.
And in the same way, as African people, once we begin to assert our own interest and not the interest of the people who have power over us, that's when we become unreasonable, that's when we become dangerous, that's when we become unable to work with.
Right.
So we have to ask ourselves, when we have these descendants of our oppressors partnering with us, are they partnering with us out of an interest that they share with us, or are they partnering with us out of their individual interest? And if we look at the historical record, it's always been individual interest always takes precedent over the interest of the other.
Right.
And we're always the other within the American context. We've never been included into the democratic experiment, the so-called democratic experiment of the American nation.
Right. What's the next topic that we have?
This phenomenon of whites allying with blacks, it goes against some of the theories of our most respected scholars like Francis Cress Welsing, who argued that there was a fear of genetic annihilation. And I'll let my wife elaborate more on that. How do you think Francis Welsing's theories conflict with what we're seeing today?
It conflicts on a deep level. Francis basically, her study was that white people are not just, it's not that they just don't like black people. They literally have a fear of being genetically wiped off of the planet. And they understand that they are a minority, and they understand that our genes are superior. And they understand that if we continue to procreate, we continue to procreate on the level and the rate that we are, and they continue to not procreate, they will be genetically wiped off the earth, and that is a fear of theirs. So that's why they're always frazzled, and they're always tense when they're around black people, because they understand that if they allow these people to continue to live and breathe and live their lives, that can mean the end for them.
Right. It conflicts with the basic sense of self-preservation that is a part of every living organism.
Everything.
And we can't rely on something that goes against that basic survival instinct and then say that it's something that could somehow propel us to our destiny as a whole. And one of the things I really wanted to speak on as well was this idea that we are our ancestors. Within our culture, whether you're African-centered or not, there's a lot of celebration of ancestors like Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, Malcolm X, people who have sacrificed and worked hard to achieve some level of self-respect within the American context. And I think it's a shame that we say these words, but we don't, in our behavior, emulate the meaning of those words. And by that I mean, in the same way we are our ancestors, our enemies are their ancestors. So when you ally with a descendant of your oppressors, you're also allying with the enemy of your ancestors. So in the same way, it wouldn't be reasonable for Nat Turner to form an alliance with Thomas Jefferson. It's not reasonable for us to form an ally with our co-workers who may be nice to us, but at the end of the day, they are their ancestors. In the same way, it would not be reasonable for Dudi Boukman or Jean-Jacques Dessalines to form an alliance with Napoleon Bonaparte. It's not proper for us to form an alliance with someone who we met at a sporting event, which, again, they may be a nice individual, but they are their ancestors, and we are our ancestors.
And we can't even claim that we're our ancestors' wildest dreams, and then not acknowledge that white people are also their ancestors' wildest dreams. You see what I'm saying? So if you're going to speak these things, you have to understand that there's an opposite to any and everything. And once you understand that, then you start to understand, okay, well, if I'm my ancestors and they're their ancestors, there's a conflict. And we also, my husband and I, we were like, they were black people, our ancestors, the ones who we claim that we are, and the ones who we claim that we respect. Our ancestors went their whole lives and never met one nice white person. Every white person was an enemy. Every white person could potentially kill them. So when you understand that, you have to sit back and say, if every white person that my ancestors saw or encountered was a potential threat to them, to their husbands, to their children, how dare I put myself in a position where I'm saying that the people that they were afraid of on sight, I can somehow change them.
And here's the thing, the fear of Yoruba was implanted in African children in utero, meaning before they were even born. So there was this phenomenon during the slave days where slave masters would buck break their men, and that means they would brutalize them, they would castrate them, they would rape them, and they would do all of this in the presence of pregnant black women. And the idea was that if they had that adrenaline rush of fear coursing through the veins of the black woman, that fear would also find its way into the
the
unborn
uterus.
child.
Yes.
And so the child will be born
Into
with fear in its system.
Yep.
And that fear that they're implanting in the African child before they're born, they're telling you that they have no problem with us seeing them as their enemies. The problem is we have a problem with seeing them as our enemies.
Right. Right.
So, and once we get over that, once we get over the fact that we should see them as our enemies based off of their historical behavior towards us, then we'll be able to act in ways that are consistent with the desires of our ancestors,
Right.
and not consistent with the desires of the enemies of our ancestors.
Right. Right.
So all of this is coming from a spiritual perspective, and for a lot of people, unless they're African centered, it doesn't hold as much water. So I want to add a little bit of empirical data. Not that the empirical data is more important, but just to round out our analysis of Yoruba and how Yoruba allies represent our ancestors' worst nightmare.
Right.
So according to the Washington Post, an article that came out recently, it stated that the typical black household now has just 6% of the wealth of the typical white household. And also the median white household had $111,146 in wealth. And that's compared to $7,113 in median wealth for the black household. And to translate that another way, you would have to combine the net worth of 11.5 black households to get the net worth of the typical one typical white household. So the white household has 12 times the median wealth of the black household. So you have to ask yourself, when you take that conglomeration of 12 white families, and then you 12 black families, and you say that's equal to one white family, you have to understand that those that one white family was able to maintain that disparity through conscious, calculated policy that reinforces advantage over multiple generations.
This is also for the majority of black people who would argue that things are getting better, things are changing in America, and you have to ask yourself how, if these white people are able to maintain this amount of wealth and maintain this level of dominance over African people for this amount of time, how are they doing this without talking to each other? In some sense, there has to be some type of communication. The system flows and it works so too smoothly for there not to be some type of dialogue that happens when black people are not in the room. So you have to ask yourself, these white friends, these white family members, these white co-workers that you're saying that you have and that are allies, these white people who are at these protests with you, you have to ask yourself, when I'm not around, what is being discussed to ensure that they remain up here and we remain down here? Because it's you can't attribute it to the system. No, the system is working just like our analogy of if you only had 2 employees working at a restaurant and all other employees called out, that restaurant would not run smoothly. If the cashier is gone and the waiter is gone and all you have is a busboy and a host, and you don't have a cook, how are things gonna flow? Everybody in the restaurant has to be present. A meeting before the shift starts in order for everything to work smoothly. So what we're saying is the system is working too smoothly for nobody to be talking to each other about making sure it remains running smoothly.
Right. In the same way a Fortune 500 company can't clumsily stumble their way into multi-billion-dollar status.
Whoops.
You can't clumsily stumble your way into century upon century of white supremacist domination. That requires concerted effort on the part of masses of people.
Right.
And then we also have to ask ourselves, historically speaking, has there ever been a period in American history, because we're talking about the American experience, even though this is a global phenomenon, where a mass of white people organized to resist racism by attacking other whites, and that movement wasn't initiated by a black person?
It hasn't happened.
That's never happened. And I know a lot of people, they would point to the Civil War as an example, but that's not an example, because as we all know, shortly following the Civil War, there was something called the North-South Compact, in which all the Union soldiers withdrew from the South and allowed the clanocracy and the racist power structure to reclaim their power, and then put us in the predicament that we're in today.
Right.
You know, so we have to understand that until you have this historical, because we spoke on the spiritual aspect of why we're fundamentally distinct, but on top of that, the historical record doesn't in any way support this thesis that there are somehow workable partners for African people in our desire to free ourselves and become more sovereign.
Right.
I think to myself, what was the origin of the white ally? Because even though the phrase white ally is relatively new, I think the phenomenon is as old as Columbus and the transatlantic slave trade. And my idea is that the first white ally was the missionary, the person who came with the Bible in hand, who prepared the way for the killers to construct the society that they envisioned. They understood that the first conquest had to be the conquest of the mind. And once you conquered the mind of the inhabitants, it would therefore be easier to conquer the land.
You didn't have to do much after that.
It would be easier to conquer the land and exploit the labor of the oppressed. So do you have anything to add on this element of missionaries and conquering the mind of Africans by spiritually colonizing them and making them loyal to whites over black?
Yeah, I mean, it was very, very calculated, honestly, on their part when they came in with the white Jesus. They understood that if they could get us to worship something that didn't look like us, they could unleash so much death, destruction,
and we'll do it to ourselves.
And we would ask for it. We would almost be thankful for it because it's coming from white people. But if it was coming from black people, then there would be a resistance. So it was very calculated, and you have to remind yourself, when these white missionaries came into our spaces, they came with peace looking, very kind words, very opening arms. I'm pretty sure their voices sound the same as they do now, very welcoming. Hi, how are you? It doesn't sound intimidating, but what we have to understand is we're in a spiritual war. We cannot go off of what we hear and what we see. We have to go off of history, and we have to go off a spiritual sense of where you're operating from. Because somebody that is coming from a spiritual space of darkness can present themselves as light. So we have to understand that we just have to be very keen, and our senses have to be up at all times. And I think that as African people, that's been one thing that we've not been good at, is we haven't been able to recognize the enemy. We've always been welcoming because we think of other people as us. We think that anything that isn't us can potentially be us, and we think people can become us, but they can't. And
that's one of the reasons why, and I love to talk about, the Haitian Revolution was so successful, because that was an example of an African people who did not allow themselves to be despiritualized. So in their practice of indigenous African religion of Voodoo, they was able to summon the type of energy that could defeat the largest army on earth. And we have to understand at the time. So we have to understand that if we're spiritually captive to a people, we will also be materially captive to those people. And once we become spiritually liberated, we'll become materially liberated. Because at the base of everything in existence is spirit, not material. And we've been tricked into thinking that the material is all there is. And when we think the material is all there is, then we tend to neglect the spiritual and only latch on to that which is material. So conflicts that are fundamentally spiritual in nature, they get diluted and belittled as political problems. So when police kill Africans in the street, we say that's a problem of police training. That's a problem of civil rights. That's a problem of racism, which all is true, but these are only symptoms of an underlying spiritual illness. We've taken this kind of model that is more proper for the advertising industry, and we've put it into our resistance struggle. So this is why you have things like Amazon.com advertising Black Lives Matter, or you have things like boulevards and and all of these celebrities jumping on the Black Lives Matter bandwagon. Not to say that Black Lives Matter is ever really radical.
No, Black Lives Matter is
But
not.
you have to understand that whenever you allow commercial interests to infiltrate your movement, then the interests of those movements will be manufactured so that they align with the interest of that commercial entity. So whatever that entity is, they're going to co-opt and guide the interests of your movement to satisfy them over yourself.
Basically, when corporations and white people start advocating for the same thing you're advocating for, you're doing it wrong.
Right. If Corona and all the stuff that in the police killings and all that, think of that as a sinking ship. The sinking ship of America is on full display to the world. And Yoruba and so-called white allies, they're using African people as flotation devices. They're using us not because we have any intrinsic worth to them, but because in their time of need, they understand that when the veil is being ripped off and the writing is on the wall and everyone sees the true face of Yoruba, they need a flotation device to prevent them from going under.
Yeah, it looks good on their part. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they post Black Lives Matter? Why wouldn't they? It's in their best interest to do so because it continues the lie. It furthers the lie.
Yeah.
And white people, you have to understand, are master manipulators and master liars.
Right.
This is not to say you can't have nice white people. But we're not talking about being nice. We're talking about a spiritual need and urge to lie and to maintain the lie for centuries upon centuries upon centuries.
I think when we talk about allyship, we can't separate that from our conception of God and our conception of what's divine. Because if we are a people of God and a people who claim some divinity, then we can't affiliate with that which doesn't reflect that divinity. So, and I just want to read briefly a passage from Baba Mwalimu Baruchi's book, Homosexuality and the Feminization of the Black Male. And it's a pretty lengthy quote, but I think it really puts into perspective just how toxic the European conception of God is, and also how that is responsible for a lot of the stuff we see today.
Yeah, and listen to the way he describes things very carefully.
He says, Europeans are psychopathic because their origin is psychogenetically flawed. Psychologically, as individuals and a culture, they were born out of a mental and emotional conflict. If you were birthed on a glacier existing for no less than 900 generations in the freezing cold, surviving off whatever other living creatures you could hunt down and kill, including your own children, because plant life was virtually non-existent, what would your conception of God be? With men physically the most vicious, how could you imagine an omnipotent God as anything but a him? Could you even begin to visualize a kind God, a just God, a merciful God, a loving God who committed you to a frigid, unmerciful hell? Would you ever forget your betrayal, your disfavor? And if this became your conception of the Almighty and He your model, how would you approach others? Would it be with kindness, reciprocity, truth, and humanity, or treachery, apprehension, and delusions of having an absolutely suffocating power and control over them? So that pretty much captures, I think, in total, the type of sadism and psychopathic psychology that informs everything that you see, even among the allies. Because remember, the point of allyship isn't to partner and progress towards a common goal. It's to keep tabs. It's to control, to monitor, to dilute, to confuse the issue. You know, so you can derail people from their goal.
The mission.
Because whatever doesn't look like them, whatever isn't able to convert to their way,
they want to
becomes
destroy.
an enemy.
Like, and we've seen them do that numerous times, and we think that when they do it to other countries, that doesn't mean they would do it to us. Like, we've literally seen America destroy other countries repeatedly, simply because they're different, and simply because they won't accept what they want them to accept. So how do we think that it's not going to happen between black and white people?
People also become prosperous when they understand their sovereign national identity. And people become weak when they neglect their sovereign national identity, and they structure everything internal to the country based off of private interests. meaning the interest of others.
Right.
Our ancestors' traditions are constantly being deregulated. They're constantly being under attack as if they're primitive, as if they're obsolete, and that we all should be moving toward this modern raceless society where we don't have any type of real grounding in our Africanity.
Right, and it's very frustrating to watch, to be honest. We don't believe in protesting, but we've seen pictures, so many pictures of protests, and we always see more white people than we see black people.
Right.
And it's like,
even Dr. King didn't have
even
that
Dr.
many.
King didn't have that many white people.
European.
Now we have all of these same ancestral people walking around in these protests, and black people are allowing it. We are welcoming in the stranger.
Not simply allowing, but
encouraging it.
Yes.
We're praising it.
Like
We go with them to the protest.
As if it gives it more credibility, where
Yes.
in actuality it gives it less credibility.
It makes it look like, well, we'll be here for another 500 years.
Right.
This is where we'll be 500 years from now.
Right.
Like, the whole intent of it is to dilute the movement, to ensure that it doesn't, whatever we're asking for, we don't get. In the meantime, presenting themselves as wanting the same things as we want. But what we don't understand is, for white people to want the same things that black people want would mean that eventual end to their existence.
Right.
No human being, no living thing will consent to something that will further their demise. Ask yourself that. Would you consent to something that would mean I will no longer be here anymore eventually? And that sounds drastic if you don't understand who white people are, and that's why we touched on that earlier. White people, they have a fear of being genetically annihilated. So us saying no justice, no peace, I can't breathe, all those things, that means that they're winning. That means that they're doing something right. And that means they want it to continue because they want to continue to live. Just like black people are asking to live, they're asking to live. And the way that they ask to live is by showing up and diluting any protest, any progress that black people may have. It's not real progress, but they want to dilute even the false progress. So once you understand that, you'll be much more hostile, not just against, but hostile to seeing white people do any type of work with black people when it comes to liberating us from their rule. It just doesn't even make sense. Would the lion protest for the gazelle to not be eaten by the lion? No, the lion needs food, and if he protests for the gazelle to live, then that means he don't have no food, and now he did.
Right. Would the snake protest with other snakes to stop eating the frogs? You know.
Now they may pretend to be on their side. They might say, yeah, gazelles, come on, we're gonna figure this out. Let's work together to see why we eating you and how we can stop eating you. And the goal of that is to get the gazelles in their presence so that they can eat them, so that they can live.
Another goal of this is to get things back to, quote, normal.
Yes.
And normal doesn't mean the cessation of your oppression.
Right.
Normal is your oppression is invisible. So a lot of times, and that's why I asked the question, when was the last time you seen a mass of white people protest against racism? And it was all white people fighting other white people to end racism.
Right.
That never happened because they're satisfied with the racism as long as it's not being talked about.
As long as we're shedding the stuff.
But once it hits the headlines, once it's on the evening news, then they feel compelled not to defend the sanctity of black life, but to defend the sanctity of their own image.
Right.
To defend their own image. Again, we're the flotation device on the sinking ship. And the ship is sinking, and they're like, grab the flotation device.
Here it comes.
And you're the flotation device. And then when everything gets back to normal, they throw the flotation device back on the trash heap, and they go back to their privileged position. And that's what we have to understand. We shouldn't consent to this treatment where we're only serviceable when it's in the headlines. Because if racism was something that was a true priority for America, it would be in the front page headline every day in American history. And if you look through the archives of newspapers, I can guarantee you every day on the front page it wasn't about racism. Before these police killings, it was about corona, but they don't talk about that the chief victims of this coronavirus have been black business owners, as with every disaster within American society. Since corona happened, more than half of black people are unemployed. More than half. That's more than 50%. That's depression numbers. But again, as long as it doesn't interfere with their interests, then it's not an issue. And that's what we have to understand. Their interests are mutually incompatible with our interests.
And there's nothing wrong with that. What we're saying is we should have that same stance when it comes to our interests.
Right.
The problem is we want what they want,
Right.
and they want us dead.
And
We want ourselves dead if we want what they want.
We've talked a lot about the problems, and I think now we want to offer some, as we do in every video, some concrete steps to kind of come out of this cycle of dependency and really begin to assert ourselves as independent and empowered people. So what are some of the things that you feel would help us rise to the level of self-actualization when it comes to how we launch our political movements?
We have to understand that I think that's always one of the first solutions is,
Who's our enemy?
no, that's ABC, honestly. But we have to understand that we're Africans and that we have a culture, we have a language, we have a spirituality that we have to go back to. And the whole purpose of America was to rip us from, like, because when you think about it, white people could have easily just moved into Africa and said, everything's plentiful here, let's just stay here and dominate while we're in Africa. But they were like, no, let's pull them from everything they know, rip their families apart, rip them from their spirituality, rip them from their diet, rip them from everything, rip them from everything. So that's the whole purpose of America, and they're furthering it today. Everything that we do in America is furthering us and pushing us further and further away from who we are as African people. So once you understand that, I think you can properly start making moves and adjustments to remove yourself from that space.
And what I'm going to suggest, I think that's a great answer, but what I'm going to suggest is kind of counterintuitive, but I think it's worth thinking about. I think one of the simplest and easiest things we can do to begin to reform how we live is to adjust our diets. And by that I mean, when you start to understand that food is medicine, and that you can heal yourself by what you eat,
right,
and that you can eliminate certain things in your diet that make you feel sluggish, that healing on the physical will then spark a healing on the spiritual level. Because again, in the African understanding of things, the physical and the spiritual are always connected. So if you take care of your physical self, it'll reflect in how you spiritually interact with the world.
The way you think is attributed to how we eat, right, as well. Right. So, and white people understand that, which is why they push such unhealthy snacks, such unhealthy food eating practices on black communities. If you go to a convenience store, you're going to see nothing but white sugar,
high fructose
corn syrup, and water that has chemicals in it.
Right. And also, I think we should also make it a daily practice of learning something about our ancestors. In the same way we can learn about artists like musicians and celebrities, we should be holding in high regard the people who laid the foundation for us to live and thrive as we do today in our own ways, because we aren't thriving at the level we should be, but to the extent that we do have thriving, it's a product of what our ancestors have poured into us. So we should make it a daily routine of meditating and celebrating our ancestors, because what happens is the more in line you become with them, the more out of line you'll become with them, meaning Yoruba. So they. And that's why I'm saying we have to take seriously the statement that I am our ancestors, not just as a slogan for a T-shirt, right, but these are kind of guiding principles for leading a healthy, productive life.
Right. You can't just say things just because they sound good. You have to understand the meaning, and you have to understand what you're saying, and you have to align your life with what you say.
Right.
You can't say I am my ancestors and then commune with people who they are their ancestors as well, and y'all ancestors will not be good.
Right. So these are just some of the kind of elementary lessons that I think can be drawn from anybody who's looking at current events today with open eyes and with a critical lens. But this is something that is not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of unlearning that has to be done. But that unlearning can only begin once we admit that there's an illness, that there's an illness in the system. And once we diagnose that illness, we can begin the process of healing, and we can begin the process of recuperation. So
yeah, and lastly, I would just want to say, please, 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 please be mindful and be aware and steer clear of people in the community who look black but are advocating for white allies. The Michael Renders, the Clifford Harrises, please steer clear. The Keisha Lance Bottoms. Please steer clear of these people, because they look like you, but they are leading you down a lane of destruction. And they are in cahoots with white people more than they are in cahoots with black people. They're benefiting from telling you that white allies is the key to the liberation. Please steer clear of these people. Their interest is not black people. They don't love black people the way that they should. They don't.
And also, just think of it on this basic level. If we truly, because again, we keep having to go back, if we truly love our ancestors, we don't need any allies. That's more than enough. One ancestor is worth 1 million allies.
White
allies. One Nat Turner is worth more than 1 million white allies. One John Jacques Dessalines is worth more than 2 million white allies.
Yeah.
So we're saying that once you understand the power, the spiritual power of being connected to our ancestral legacy, the idea of allyship, you will look at it as an insult to your ancestors.
It is. It's the biggest insult. And protesting. We also have to stop protesting.
Right.
We're past that.
Right.
It's literally getting worse.
Right.
You protest, the more you protest, the worse it gets.
Children protest their parents.
Right. There was an episode of Hey Arnold, and he was protesting for the man to give him ice cream. You're protesting for people to stop killing you. You see the difference? There's times to protest, and there's times to not protest. This is the time to not protest.
This is the time to nation build.
Right. So at this point, there shouldn't be any more protests. Honestly, black people.
A moratorium on protest.
Yeah, that's over. Especially based off what we said earlier about who white people are and how they can't be changed, and this is their assembly, and that this is something that a spiritual warfare. Your protest on the physical level is not going to do anything on the spiritual level. We have to fight them spiritually, and we have to get out of their vicinity.
Right.
Get out of their vicinity.
Right.
Get out of their vicinity.
And I'll just leave this as a lasting thought to contemplate. And again, this is from the mainstream source, the Washington Post. That same article, it mentions that the wealth gap currently is wider than it was in 1968. And that was during the height of the civil rights movement. And my wife's going to read it.
So the quote says, there are no actions that black Americans can take unilaterally that will have much of an effort of reducing the racial wealth gap.
I'll just read that again just in case it didn't sink in. There are no actions that black Americans can take unilaterally that will have much of an effect on reducing the racial wealth gap. It has to be done either bilaterally or multilaterally, meaning it has to be done in cooperation with people who don't look like us. Now ask yourself, when in the history of the world has there been an oppressive group who's been benefiting off of the exploitation of another group at no cost to themselves, and they just freely relinquish that power? When has that ever happened? Freely relinquished it in response to protest. That's never happened.
Non-violent protest at that.
The only instances where that has happened is when they've had wars waged against them to the point where they couldn't sustain the gains that they got from the exploited.
Right.
And I'm saying that's the kind of understanding that we have to approach the current situation with. That they aren't going to relinquish benefits that cost them nothing. again, it's against the concept of self-preservation that every living organism
Right.
practices.
Right.
So I don't have anything else to say. I think we hammered that point
Yeah.
as hard as possible.
We have.
But we share this information because
Out of
we feel
love.
that out of love, and we feel that once we have a kind of critical perspective on things, a critical perspective that attacks things at the root and not just at the symptom, we can then begin the process of truly, gaining sovereignty and not just reform. Because reform is only going to redesign an oppressive state, but we need it to end and not simply to be redesigned.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think that we touched on everything. I know that this topic, if you made it this far into the video, that it can, like we said, can be controversial, but we're just hoping and praying that our people can see the sincerity and the truth, and that we're speaking in, and that this isn't something that we just make up or that we just don't like white people. We genuinely want our people to be liberated, and we want them to see the stakes are very high right now. And yeah.
all right. So until next time, we love you guys and stay strong. Peace.
Bye, family.